for now. Okay, so before we start, a quick disclaimer. I'm sure people have seen this slide before. Don't make any purchasing decisions on things you see in this presentation. Just make them on currently available features. Um, okay, a quick intro about me. My name is Ahmed Khan. I've been with Salesforce for about a year and a half, over a year and a half now. I am part of the security team at Salesforce, the enterprise security team to be precise. Part of my job involves looking at Salesforce orgs. So naturally, being Salesforce, we use Salesforce extensively within the company. And we face challenges similar to what other companies may face in terms of managing our orgs and securing our orgs. So that's part of my job. Another part of my job is managing or doing penetration testing. So we do a lot of security assessments on web applications and other types of applications. We go in, try to find different vulnerabilities, find ways to, maybe get into the servers or access different accounts. So that's a fun part of the job. And then maybe a quick poll to the audience. How many people here have been using Salesforce for less than 2 years? Maybe raise your hands, a few. And then 2 to 5 years? Okay, and more than 5 years? Okay, we sort of have a bell curve, so that's nice. That's my email address up if you guys have questions later on. Okay, so this is our basic agenda. We'll just set the context, set the stage for the talk. We'll go over some core security principles, and then we'll get into the meat of the talk, which is the basic defenses we can implement for our talk, for our org. And also, by way of definition, whenever we say org, we are referring to an instance of Salesforce. So you go to login.salesforce.com, you enter your credentials, you come across a screen where you have the different tabs, you can look at your accounts and opportunities. So that is an org, right? So in this talk, we're interested in securing our org, securing the data in our org and access to our org. Okay, setting the stage. So what exactly do we mean and what are we talking about when we say secure our org? Well, we can think of a house, right? Suppose we have a house. It comes with state-of-the-art security system, motion detectors and laser beams and I don't know whatnot, right? But as the owner of the house and as a tenant living in the house, you still have to lock your door before you go to sleep. You still have to close your windows and latch the windows, right? So if you leave your door wide open, maybe your security system, your home security system won't really help you as much as it could, right? So similarly, in the Salesforce org, there are a few things we need to take care of. So first of all is user access, right? We need to make sure only users who are supposed to have access to the org have access to it, or users who do have access to the org only have access to data they need to have access to, and not like all the data in the org. So that's a basic step we need to take care of. Another thing is connected apps. So if we are giving external entities access to our data, right, an external vendor or cloud application has access to our Salesforce data, we need to make sure that access is scoped down, so it's not open to all the data in the org. If we stop using that external vendor, we need to make sure we remove that access. So that's another aspect an admin needs to take care of. And then thirdly, we have custom code. So if within our org and within our company we have developers writing code, we need to make sure we're not introducing new vulnerabilities into the system, right? So we have like plenty of resources and guidelines to tell us how to develop our org, how to develop our code, and how to check for security vulnerabilities. And then finally, we have like compromised accounts. So in a larger organization, you may have employees who aren't so careful with their passwords. They may share their password out or leak it in one way or another. So as security-minded admins, we need to account for that possibility. It will generally happen in given a large enough user base, right? So we need to do some damage control, limit scopes of data access as much as possible, so that in case of a compromised account, that account doesn't compromise all the data in an org. Okay, so that's that. So that was setting the stage. So let's go on to 2 core security principles. And These principles we will continue to refer to throughout the talk, so we need to ingrain these principles in our minds. Okay, so first of all is defense in depth, right? So the idea behind defense in depth is we want to have multiple layers of defense, right? The idea being that any layer of defense or any security control has the potential to fail, right? If we're relying on a single layer of defense and it fails, then we're compromised. But the more layers of defense we have, the less likely it is that all of them fail at the same time, right? So up on the screen we have a picture of a castle, right? Castles back in the day were an important part of society that sort of protect the townspeople and the courts and the nobility, and naturally they had high security requirements, right? And we see they have a really thick wall, multiple feet of stone and multiple, like a really thick wooden door, but they didn't rely only on their walls, right? They also have like a moat around the castle. They have watchtowers. They have guards patrolling on the walls, right? And so if someone were to, for example, scale the walls, well, the guards will see them. Or if a large army wanted to storm the castle, well, there is the moat stopping them. So if any of the layers of defense fails, you have other layers of defense to mitigate for it. So that's the first principle. Defense in depth. The more layers of defense, usually the better, and because there's less chance of all of them failing at the same time. And the second layer, the second core security principle we need to ingrain is the principle of least privilege, right? So, like by definition, that means that each entity within our system or each user within the system should have the least amount of privileges they need to do their job. So I guess continuing with the castle analogy, suppose you have different people in our castle, they have different roles. So you have the guards in the guard towers, you have a gardener, right, maintaining the garden. So the gardener needs access to the courtyard, needs access to the rose garden and to the plants and to the grass. And the gardener probably doesn't need access to the watchtower. The watchtower just has cold steel and stone and no plants of any sort in there. So the principle of least privilege would dictate that the gardener should not be given access to the guard tower, right? So like how that would help us is suppose the gardener is compromised in some way. Someone coerces the gardener into spying on the castle, right? Now the gardener tries to go into the guard tower and the guards are like, nope, you don't need to come in here, so therefore you don't have access, right? So the principle of least privilege effectively limits the damage that can happen. So this is similar to an org where, if we have a compromised account, it has limited damage that it could do. So that's that. So those were our two core security principles, defense in depth and principle of least privilege. Okay, moving on to fundamental defenses. So I think now we'll get a bit more concrete and relate things to Salesforce. So here are the four things we'll cover. So user and access management, health check, two-factor authentication, and IP whitelisting. So first up is user and access management. So as admins in the org, or involved in the administration, we need to make sure that only users who need access to the org have access. So, well, I guess first of all, on the right-hand side of the screen, we sort of broke down the different layers of access management, right? So at the very top is access to the org as a whole, right? So oftentimes what happens is we start using Salesforce, people like the product, we get more and more users, we add more people to it, and over the years, as is pretty common in the Silicon Valley, people will start moving to other companies, and maybe someone who's been using Salesforce pretty extensively within the company goes on to move for the competition, right? So the principle of least privilege says that someone working for the competition probably shouldn't have any access at all to the org, right? So when someone does leave the company, we need to make sure that we deprovision that account, right? And that person doesn't have any access to the org anymore. But oftentimes that becomes difficult to manage because, especially if you have a large company with thousands of people, you don't know who's coming in and who's going out, and but as an admin, as security-minded admins, we do need to take care of that. So, and like how exactly do we do that? This is like a network, an opportunity for the admin to network with other divisions within the company. So you network with HR, you network with IT, right? HR generally does have pretty good visibility on who's leaving. So you can implement a process where whenever someone does leave, they go through a deep provisioning run list. They contact the Salesforce admin. They remove access to the org. And then similarly, like people who move around within the company, right? We need to change that access to. So users who have access to the org, and then also connected apps and API users. So again, if we're allowing any external entities to connect to our org, we need to maintain close watch over those accounts. If we stop using this external cloud vendor or whatever external service, we need to revoke that access as soon as we need to. And then also SSO, if anyone uses SSO internally, single sign-on internally, Salesforce supports that. We can easily integrate with your SSO system. That makes user management much easier. You do provision the user from a single spot in your SSO system that revokes access across the system, including access to Salesforce. Okay. This is how you freeze user accounts or deactivate user accounts. You can click the freeze button over here, or to completely deactivate the account, you can click edit and then uncheck the active box. Okay, so that's access to the org as a whole. And then next up is, once you do have access to the org, you want to restrict access to data within the org. So maybe a naive way of setting up access is every user in the org has access to all the data, right? And that sort of violates the system of least privilege. And that's generally the easiest way of setting up access, and so that's why people have a natural tendency to do that, but generally you don't want to do that for security purposes. So just a quick refresher, I'm sure people are familiar with CRUD and FLS, but so we have objects, they're sort of like tables. And you have the accounts object and the opportunities object. So you can have CRUD permissions. You can give out create permissions on an object, or read permissions, or update permissions, or delete permissions. So a delete permission would allow a user to delete records from an object. And then within an object, like within a table, you have field level security. So that's FLS. So that controls what fields you have access to. And then sharing is sort of record level permissions or row level permissions. So we need to manage access at each of those levels. So those CRUD and FLS permissions are set at the profile level. So when you create your profiles, you need to scope them down to the specific roles. So suppose you have, in your organization, you have a finance department, you have a sales department. Right? So people in the finance department shouldn't need access to the sales records. The salespeople generally shouldn't have access to the financial records. Right? So as an admin, we want to break both of those down into two separate profiles. Right? We don't want to lump them on a single profile. So, and the sales profile only has CRUD and FLS permissions on the sales documents and the sales objects, and doesn't have any CRUD and FLS permissions on the finance objects. So two things, develop profiles that are specific for each role, and in each of those profiles, minimize the CRUD and FLS permissions to the least privilege they need for their job. And here's a quick screenshot of how you can set those up. You just go to the setup menu, search for profiles, and then you go to the object permissions section. So here we have accounts. For this specific profile, we only gave them read access on accounts. So any users under this profile will not be able to edit accounts. And maybe for this specific user type, that's all they need. Okay, moving on to sharing. So sharing, like we saw earlier, is record level access. So let's go on a slide. So you can have, first of all, public versus private. So public means someone with access to the object has access to all the records within the object. And generally, you don't want to do that unless you need to. So the principle of least privilege says go with private, because private will only allow them access to the objects they own, and maybe like records that are in their role hierarchy and sharing rules. So there are like details on how exactly sharing is controlled. But in general, you only have access to records you actually own. Versus public is you have access to all the records in the object. So whenever possible, you want to set your sharing defaults, your organization-wide defaults, to private. And then secondly, you have internal sharing defaults and external sharing defaults. So internal sharing defaults, these are generally for people who have a direct login to the org. And external sharing defaults, these are for people coming in through public-facing communities or portals, maybe external chatter users. So you need to be very careful with those sharing defaults. So if you have a public-facing community where anyone in the internet could access your org through this community, and you set the sharing defaults to public, they could potentially access different records within your org through the community. So you do not want to open up public records unless you absolutely know that people outside the company do need access to all the records. Okay, so that is that. Here's how you set up sharing. You go to the setup menu, search for sharing. You see the two columns. On the right, you have external access. On the left, you have internal access. So you need to scope that down as much as you can. Okay, so that was, I think, a lot of stuff. If you need more time to digest that, we have this really good trail on Trailhead called Protect Your Salesforce Data. It will go into detail into each one of those. It's sort of an easy to consume and fun trail. And it will go into a bit more detail in other aspects of user and access management. So I highly recommend everyone to go through that trail on Trailhead. Okay, so we're done with user and access management. So on the right-hand side of the screen, you see we are starting to build out our layers of defense. So at the core, we have user and access management. Right? So far, we've locked down our user accounts. Right? We've made sure that only legitimate users have access to the org. And even for those legitimate users, they only have access to data they need and not more than that. Okay? So now what happens if you have a user with a legitimate account and they only have access to data they need, but they have a very weak password. So in a large company, generally you will have people whose favorite password is like 12345, someone or another, given a large enough user base, right? And then like a malicious adversary comes along. He's like, okay, I really like this company's data. I need access to it. I'm going to try to guess usernames and passwords. So he finds a username on an email address on LinkedIn, tries different passwords, tries a few dozen passwords, and sure enough, he tries 12345. It works, and now he's in the org. Right now our org is compromised because one of our employees had a very weak and easy to guess password. So one way to protect against that is, so Salesforce does give you control over password requirements. So you can enforce a minimum password length. You could enforce password history. So if users change their password, they can't use a password they've used recently. You can lock people out if there is a large number of invalid logins. So that's an indication that something fishy is going on. And then you can have like session timeout. So if a logged in session is compromised, you could have it automatically log out after some time. So now all of these different security controls can get a bit confusing or overwhelming. There are so many different knobs you can set. So that's where the health check comes in. So health check is a really nice tool which will give you recommendations. What Salesforce recommends you set all the knobs to. So it's very easy to run. You go to the setup menu, search for health check. It just runs automatically. It gives you a rating on how your settings are like compared to the recommended baseline, and you can adjust all those knobs. So this is a very easy step to take. Everyone, just maybe even tonight, you can go home and run your health check and get a good idea of your password and session requirements. Okay, so far now we have an extra layer of defense. So first of all, we have legitimate users only. Those users have scope down access. They only have access to the data they need. And we have strong passwords. Okay, so we're feeling a bit more confident about our security. So now we come across a problem. Passwords are sort of a weak link in the security chain. Passwords are very easily stolen. So people maybe following the news over the past 5 years or so have heard of like the Yahoo breach of email accounts and passwords, and the LinkedIn breach, and the Adobe breach, and you have all these major brand names who have breaches of their credentials, their usernames and passwords, and usually people tend to reuse their passwords across different accounts. So oftentimes I'll use a specific password on LinkedIn, I'll use that same password on Facebook, and that same password. Well, we have someone saying no, he doesn't use, he doesn't reuse his password, so that's good. But from an admin perspective, right, even though we have superstars like this guy over here, we still have, within our user base, we still have individuals who do reuse their passwords. And I'm definitely guilty of reusing my password in the past, or maybe even now, I'm not sure. But you'll reuse the password Salesforce and LinkedIn and Twitter, and Facebook, and maybe some random shopping websites and some really fancy, analytics app that you found on the internet, but among all of those services, you're also using that password on Salesforce. So what happens is, if any of those dozens of services gets compromised and hacked, like for example, if major services like LinkedIn and Yahoo could get hacked, chances are smaller services with no security teams do have the potential to get hacked, right? So they get hacked, their password dump is leaked, someone obtains that username and password, and they will try to use that username and password across many different accounts, right? And now we're compromised. So despite having user accounts that are scoped to specific data, and despite having strong passwords, that password is still leaked, and our org is compromised. So a really good way to protect against that is two-factor authentication, right, or 2FA. So the idea behind 2FA is we break down and we have multiple factors required for authentication. So we break them down into what you know, what you are, and what you have. So what you know is something like a password, right? It's something in your mind, you know it, you've memorized it. And before you're given access to a system, you're challenged to provide that password that's in your mind, and then you're let in, right? And what you are is like a biometric. So maybe a fingerprint or an iris scan or something that's unique about you. So maybe some highly secured facilities would require a fingerprint or an iris scan before they let you in. So that's like a password, what you know, and also something you are. And then a second or another factor is what you have, right? And this is most commonly used for two-factor authentication because it's really easy to set up. So you might have a physical token, like an RSA token or a YubiKey. Some people may have seen those. Or you can have an authenticator app. So we have a screenshot of the Salesforce authenticator app. It's really easy to install, freely available on the Apple Store and Google Play. So you can download that app. You can use it with other services as well, so it's not limited to Salesforce. And then, so when users log in, they have to provide both their password and a one-time token that's displayed on the authenticator app, right? So now, even if we have a scenario where a user's password is compromised because they're reusing their password, well, the attacker still can't log in because they don't have your mobile phone. They don't have your user's mobile phone, and the system challenges them to input that token before they can log in. So 2FA is a really good defense. It really improves the security of your org. Setting up 2FA is simple. You just you create a 2FA permission setup menu, search for permission sets. You can create a new set the two-factor setting, assign that permission set to your user profiles, and next time users log in, they'll be invited to use 2FA, and they have strong access from that point on. Okay, so far we have legitimate accounts only, scope down access, We have strong passwords. We have two-factor authentication, right? So we need both password and a second factor to authenticate. Now, so now we're feeling even more confident about our security. There's even less a chance of someone breaching our systems. But now, suppose hypothetically that someone's traveling somewhere and they get robbed. So hopefully none of us get robbed. But suppose someone does get robbed and their key chain is stolen and their UB key or their two-factor authentication key is stolen, right? Or maybe their mobile phone is stolen, right? So now the attacker has the two-factor token. The attacker potentially knows the password through a password leak, and so the attacker could still log in to our org, right? So our next layer of defense is IP whitelisting, right? So IP addresses, they uniquely define like a networked machine. So every machine connected to the internet will generally be given an IP address. If you're within an office-like environment or within a VPN, you generally have a fixed range of IPs. So you could, in your org settings, you could actually restrict logins only from a specific IP range. So you can be like, well, I only expect my employees to log in from my office and not from, like, I don't know, some random country or on the other side of the globe. So you can say, okay, for my profiles, anyone who logs in, they have to log in from the office or from my VPN, right? So that is a pretty effective layer of defense. So even if everything's stolen, right, your two-factor token, your password, and everything, well, the person, unless they have access to your office or your VPN, they can't really log in. So this is really important to set. You can set it on all your profiles. It's important to set it on all your profiles, and especially your API users and integrations. So any external accounts, you need to be very careful on where they can log in from. So generally, cloud vendors will have a static IP that they connect from. And then to take it a step further, you can enforce login IP ranges on every request. So you can require logins from your office IPs, but then also all requests after that. And here's how you can do that. You just go to the setup menu, session settings, and check that checkbox. So at this point, we're feeling really good about our security. We have scoped down users. They only have access to the data they need. They have strong passwords. To log in, you need not just your password, but a second factor. So you need physical possession of the mobile phone. You need IP whitelisting, so you have to be on a trusted network and not any other random places. So with all these different layers of defense, it becomes very difficult for an attacker or an adversary to breach our systems and access our data. And so next steps, run the health check. Easiest first, run the health check, very simple. It will give you recommendations. Turn on IP whitelisting. That may involve working with IT to figure out your IP ranges. Turn on 2FA. That will slightly affect the login process, but that is probably, 2FA will probably mitigate a large number of the breaches that happen in today's world. So that's one of the most important security controls to turn on. And then developing a plan for user and access management. That may involve understanding how the business works, breaking down the profiles, and limiting access to the objects people really need access to. And then finally, Trailhead. Trailhead, we're investing a lot in Trailhead. There's a lot of high-quality educational content, both for developers and admins. So we didn't get too much into development security, but we do have many other talks at Trailhead DX that if you're more on the development side of things, we highly recommend checking out these talks by other members of the security team. And I think we have 4 seconds left. Thank you, everyone, for your time. I'll stick around if people have questions. And yep, thank you.